Physiological Correlates of Human Behavior, an intro to behavioral neuroscience. With me, Dr. Andrew T. Ainsworth, Professor of Psychology at California State University, Northridge. Part 1, Neural Foundations of Behavior. Lecture 2, Communication within the nervous system. Section 1, Cells in the nervous system. Just sitting around noodling on what is my son's, old ukulele, tiny soprano, Macala. And got me thinking, even little things like that take a lot of coordination. Like my hand's got to know what chords to hold. This hand's got to know how to strum. Even looking back behind me, this painting, look at all the intricate details in here. This is actually was actually painted by my wife's grandmother. So it's like my grandmother-in-law, my kid's great-grandmother. She painted this, a while ago. It was one of her, she had so many paintings that were like ceiling to floor in her house everywhere were paintings. And this was one of her bigger, more detailed ones. When I got the job here, she was so proud of me for getting the job. She gifted this to me, and I've had it ever since. It's one of my most prized possessions. It's my office right behind, my desk. You can come see it. My office anytime you want. Anyway, think about all the detail and the coordination, the vision and the imagination, everything it took to put this together and to paint it, and even to do simple things like play the ukulele, or even to watch the video you're watching now, be able to listen to it, to be able to watch it and be able to understand what I'm saying. It takes lots and lots and lots of coordination. There's many systems in our body that are required to make all this happen, all the complexities that make us human. But they all start with the tiny little microscopic cells called neurons. So we're gonna start today down a journey to talk about all these things, from the tiniest cells all the way to coordinated actions like gender and coordinated things like motivation, our senses, our movement, hunger. We're gonna talk all kinds of stuff. We gotta start at the smallest point, which is the neuron, which is where we're starting today. It's pretty amazing that we're able to do all these cool, coordinated things, very complex behaviors, very complex actions, all because of the tiny little cells in our body. And it's pretty freaking cool. That's what we're talking about today. I hope you're excited about it. It's time for some bolos for lecture 2. So let's start with section 1. Neuron, glial cell, afferent, interneuron, soma, organelles, nucleus, cytoplasm, dendrites, axon terminal, axon hillock, terminal buttons, myelin, node of Ranvier, reflex arc, oligodendrocyte, Schwann cell, saltatory conduction, multiple sclerosis, radial glia, microglia, and astrocytes. That's it for the bolos for today and for section 1. So it's time to move on to the lecture. So let's go. How does communication in our nervous system work? How do we get signals from our brain to our hands or to our feet and back up again? Today we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about communication within the nervous system, and this first section is going to be just talking about the cells and talking about their parts and their functions. And we're still doing our part
part one here of neural foundations of behavior. We're still in that first part of the course. Let's talk about it. The nervous system is very intricate. Lots and lots of cells. You can see from the photographs, there's tons of stuff going on. It's like a mesh of cells that are all doing specific functions. Yeah, it's all a very delicate system. It's very easy to throw it off. There's lots of diseases and disorders that are caused by degeneration of these kinds of cells. Substances can have unexpected effects on one or more parts of the nervous system, things like drugs, even damage to certain parts of the body or brain could throw lots of these things off. Communication becomes ceased. And we need to understand the nervous system to understand how it impacts behavior. The reason why we're talking about all this stuff, we're going into the cells and their parts and their functions, is because in order to understand how this stuff impacts behavior, we have to understand how they function and how they work. There are two basic kinds of cells we find in the nervous system. We spend a lot of time talking about neurons because those are the basic building blocks of the nervous system, and they're the ones that actually help us to create that communication within the nervous system. They convey sensory information into the brain, and they carry out operations like your plans, your thoughts, and transmit those commands out to the body. But there are other kinds of cells in the brain that don't get as much glamorous as the neurons that are doing all the work of sort of transmitting information. But these are non-neural cells that provide several supporting functions to neurons, and neurons couldn't function appropriately without glial cells. And even glial cells themselves, sometimes if they're damaged, can cause then the neurons to break down in their communication. So we'll talk about those. But first, we're going to spend some time talking about neurons, then we'll come back to talk about glial cells and their function. So there are about 86 billion neurons in the human brain alone. Right? That makes up about half the brain's cells, which means the other half are things like glial cells and other kinds of cells like blood and other things that are in the brain. Neurons are responsible for movement, thought, memory, emotion, essentially anything that we think or do or feel come from neurons and our ability to communicate between our brain and our extremities. Neurons are simple in action and structure. It's not going to seem so simple when we talk about it because there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's simple in the sense of it relies on very simple processes. Yet its function, though, is surprisingly complex. It's just going to seem simple, but there's so many of them, working together at the same time, sometimes in coordination, that they create all kinds of very complex actions, things like playing instruments, things like being able to sing while dancing. All kinds of complex things are all being driven by these same very simple cells that work on very simple functions that we'll talk about. There are different types of neurons. We classify neurons in terms of what they're doing. Essentially, we classify them as sort of which direction is the information going. Is it going from the brain to the body, or is it going from the body back to the brain? So afferent neurons are what we consider sensory neurons. These are the neurons that transport information from your hands or your feet to your face or wherever to your brain, so you can feel things, you can sense things. That includes hearing, includes sight, includes taste, like all the different senses. And then there are efferent neurons. These are motor neurons. These are the ones that transfer information from the brain to the spinal cord, to the muscles and glands, and to trigger all kinds of actions throughout the body. One way to remember the difference is efferent neurons require effort. Like they're the effortful things that you're doing, like moving my hand, speaking. Those are things that I'm doing with effort. Therefore, they require efferent neurons. And then there are also other kinds of neurons, like interneurons, that help neurons communicate with one another. Sometimes it's not specifically an afferent or efferent neuron. Sometimes these neurons need to get connected to one another, and those are interneurons. They create things like a reflex arc, and there's other sort of intrinsic neurons that do have other functions besides carrying information to and from the brain and body. They connect sensory neurons with motor neurons. Sometimes they connect neurons within the same structure. Sometimes, things like the heart, or even within the brain, there are parts where there are neurons that connect just other neurons to other neurons and be able to create links. And those are these interneurons and intrinsic neurons that we'll talk about in just a bit. So let's get right down to it. What are the basic parts of a cell? I'm assuming that most of you, not all of you, have probably seen these kinds of things before. But let's talk a little bit about it, make sure we're all on the same page, and we'll go through and look at some diagrams. We have the soma. The word soma means body, so soma and cell body is a little bit redundant, but the idea is that the cell's soma, the neuron soma, is the body of it. It's where you have the brains and the powerhouse of each cell are inside of that soma. You have organelles. Organelles is a fancy catch-all term that just means the little organs within the cell. Of course, what is the largest organ within the cell? Well, it's the nucleus. You have things like the nucleolus, which are inside of the nucleus, and then there's all kinds of different things like mitochondria and different organelles that you might have heard of at different times, depending on what kind of class you take. But we're not going to get too deep into the different pieces within the cell because we got to leave some information for you to learn in a later course like 402 or something. But I do want to mention one thing that because these are cells that contain a nucleus, they're considered eukaryotic cells. Now, eukaryotic cells are found in lots of things, plants and animals. It just means that they're cells with a specific nucleus and that have all the structures and parts that we're going to be talking about, as opposed to prokaryotic, which do not have specific nucleus and are much more simple functions within the cells. They don't contain all the specific cells. So, and one of the big differences is, does it contain a nucleus or not? It makes the difference between it being eukaryotic versus prokaryotic. Our cells and our neurons are all eukaryotic because they have a nucleus and are able to generate their own energy and things like that inside the cell. Now, all these things, these organelles within the soma, are all floating around in cytoplasm, right? This is the fluid within each cell. And of course, they're all wrapped up in a membrane, okay? So those, that's the cell body. We'll come back and we'll show some pictures and talk about how this stuff works. Surrounding the cell body, generally speaking, is these things called dendrites, which are extensions of the cell body. They're there to receive information. These are basically the receptors, right? They're you think about my head being the cell body. I'm gonna have like little receptors all around to be able to receive information from other neurons and other cells within my body. And then of course there's one big fat piece that comes out from the neuron relative to the dendrites and the pieces. It's called the axon. And the axon is like a tail that comes out from the cell body. And it's what's going to carry information from that cell to other cells. It's the transmission. So you have the dendrites that are receptors, and then the axon is like the tail that is the transmission piece that's going to send information to other cells within the body. And there are parts of the axon, like the axon hillock. There's the axon terminal, and then on the axon terminals there are these terminal buttons. So you can imagine where the dendrites are these like little receptors around the cell body. The axons are more like my hand, where it has a long extension to be able to carry information quite far out there. Let me do this. It's like my arm here is carrying information out there. And at the end of each of those, I can actually have multiple terminals to be able to send information out to multiple other cells. And at each end of those cells, there is a terminal button. Looks like a little fat knob sort of at the end of each of those terminals. And we'll talk about that. It's actually where the neural transmission and neurotransmitters come in. We'll talk about that in the next section, but that's where that happens, those terminal buttons. So you can think about if my body is the cell body, right? So here's my head. Sorry, make it a little weird. My head, has the dendrites out here. It's receiving things, and this is the axons coming out to then send information out. So stuff comes in, gets sort of processed through, goes through the axon out then to other cells. Okay. And again, That's not going to be your only diagram. I'll show you more pictures in a second, but just to give you an idea of what it might look like, and so you can sort of picture it. So the hillock is the place where the axon attaches to the cell body, and then you got the terminals that are at the end, where they're then going to start to send information out to other cells in your nervous system. Okay, so far so good. We got soma, dendrites, axon. Awesome. What else? Well, we have myelin. Now, myelin does not exist in every single neuron, but a lot of motor neurons, and I think some sensory neurons, especially neurons that have to send signals a long way, like to go from your brain all the way through, say, to your foot, are gonna contain myelin or be wrapped up in myelin as a way to help insulate them, keep them, safe and warm and snuggly, right? But also to help in conduction. I'll talk about that later as well. It's going to help increase the rate of conduction across the cell, across the axon, make it faster through something called saltatory conduction, which I'll come back to shortly. I'll spell it and everything. Saltatory conduction. And that happens with myelin. Myelin has, again, there are these sheaths of fatty tissue that wrap around the axon to insulate it. And then there are these spaces, little naked parts in between, like you have each sheath that wraps around. Imagine like a pool noodle, and you got a pool noodle that so now instead of just being my arm, I now have a pool noodle on my arm, and the pool noodle goes like in segments, where in each segment there's a naked part of my arm, where my arm is sort of visible through those segments. So each one of those naked sections, the parts where there is no myelin, is called a node of Ranvier. Okay, node of Ranvier. Now I've heard people call it node of Ranvier. You get the idea. I'm pretty sure it's French. Node of Ranvier. Okay, it's the naked areas of the axons located between adjacent myelin sheaths. So the myelin does not cover the entire axon. It covers it in little chunks, little pieces. And in between each of those pieces is a little tiny naked spot on the axon that's called a node of Ranvier, right? And those nodes are going to be able to help the signal, the electric signal going down the axon. It's going to jump from node to node, making the transmission faster. And that's what the saltatory conduction is. But I'll come back to that in just a second. So let's talk about how those all come together. Now, I'm not, in any way, I'm not an artist, at least not in terms of drawing. But let's think if we can't make a rough picture of what an axon might look like. Let's see if any of these work. Okay, so we said that there's a cell body. All right, great. So let's make a body like this. Inside, it's got the nucleus, and then there are other things in here, little organelles that are in here that will be part of the cell, right? Things like mitochondria and other things that are helping to fuel the cell as it's doing its functions. Now, at one end of the cell, we're gonna have a nice sort of long extension. It's going to come out like this, and that's going to end. And like I said, it's going to have these almost like fingers with little fat knobs on the end of them, like that. Okay, knobs. Okay. Something like that. So far, it's looking pretty good. Then up here, we're going to have little other things out here that are going to be little like receptors. They're part of the cell body. They're going to be helping to like receive information to each, within the cell. You can imagine other neurons or parts or muscles or other things that this might connect to that here. So imagine there were other cells with their axon terminals that are now sending information to this one. This was not receiving information. All right, so far so good. This doesn't look so bad. I can imagine another at the other end over here. There's now, could be another. There could be another cell here that has its dendrites coming off this way. Okay. And its nucleus, and the information is traveling from this cell to that one. Could be another one down here. Its dendrites out this way. Its nucleus, its cell bodies. And here we got another axon coming out this way with its terminals and terminal buttons that are feeding information to this cell. Okay. So let's label all these. We have this piece, this whole thing here, right? The whole piece there. This is the soma. That's this entire thing here. Actually, matter of fact, I'll put this whole thing here is all soma. It's a cell body. These receptors out here, these things, right? These are the dendrites. Right, these are all dendrites. Right, we got dendrites there. This whole thing here, you gotta think, one of the things I want to make sure that I indicate here is that this is the neural conductions going this way. Right? There's neural conductions going in this direction like this from the cell body out the axon to these axon terminals. All right, that means this whole thing here is the axon. These are all these things are all the terminals. Terminals. Then you have these little things down here are the buttons. Terminal buttons. And like this is also a button. These are all the terminal buttons. Okay. Take a look at that for a second here. Take I can't take me out of this because can't take this out for a second. Look at this. We got dendrites. The only thing I didn't label, that I probably should, is that here, this thing here, that is the nucleus. And these things are the little pieces. What the color to use? These things, right? These other things out here. These are the organelles. The little parts of the cell body. That's not bad. Would you say to myself? That's big drawing of everything in here. Okay, that's get a good idea of what's going on. We're going to come back when we talk about neural transmission. We'll talk about what happens down here at these terminal buttons, but that's like again in the next section. Here we're just talking about the process within the cells. Now the only thing I didn't talk about, so you can think about this. This would be like an unmyelinated neuron where the conduction is just going down the axon. We can think about this if we start to put little things around here like this. Again, think about these like little pool noodles. I'm getting too around here. Okay, and you think of those. These are now the myelin. Right? This is myelin. Little myelin sheaths, little protective coatings. Each one of those, depending on the kind of cell, we'll talk about later. These are put on oftentimes by glial cells. They'll have a little little nucleus of their own, sometimes shown in photographs. And we'll come back. These are specific kinds of glial cells called Schwann cells that actually are the ones that they put the myelin on the axon. And you'll notice these gaps. The gaps that you see here, like this gap and that gap and that gap. These gaps in between, those are the nodes of it. So the spaces in between, like that. All the songs. That's like Dave Matthews, the space between. Anyway, so those are the spaces in between the myelin, and what that does, when instead of the neural conduction happening this way, just being along the cell, what it does is it allows the neural conduction to jump to there, to there, there, out to the cell. This jumping is called saltatory conduction. We'll talk about in a second. The only thing I didn't mention is that right here, on the end of the cell body, one we didn't like, is this thing is the space where the axon connects to the cell body. That is the axon hillock. Okay, pretty good walkthrough. So now we have all that. We did all that. Let's do it again, but with a better picture. All right, so there's my drawing, my rudimentary drawing of things. But now I have a couple diagrams. Let's go through the diagrams and actually talk about those again and be able to label things out and make sure that we're all on the same page. We'll go through this a few times because I want to get you to get an idea that there are different drawings, different ways of viewing this stuff. And they all can give you different information about how this works and be able to understand the process. So let's try it again with a better drawn diagram. So here's a diagram I found. It shows two different cells. Just to give you an idea, like again, this is a cell without myelin. Here's a cell with myelin. Let's talk about the pieces again. So let's see. What are these? The branches coming out from the cell body. That's these. These are dendrites. This whole thing here, if I'm thinking about this is all this in here. Everything within this part here would be the soma. We got the main part here that's in the middle. We got your nucleus. At the very end here, change colors. Make sure we can see it. Actually, they don't show very well. This part here, where the cell connects to this, that is the axon hillock. Okay. This whole thing here, again, we got neural conductions going all the way down this direction, up here to the end. This is all the axon. You got the terminals up here. barely see little things on the end. These are all the terminal buttons that are here. Okay. The only difference between the top and the bottom, all the same pieces, except here we have our myelin. These are all the different myelinated cells here, right? This is all myelin. And then you have each node. So you can think about, again, going through here, there, 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 there. And creating this speeded jumping conduction. Okay. These little gaps, again, are the here, like those gaps between the myelin. Those are our nodes of boundary A. All right, so hopefully all that makes sense. What's not shown here very well, I mean, there are other things going on inside of the cell body, right? It's just showing the nucleus. There are other things, or I'm not really going into detail about those other things, but besides there being organelle, generically, okay? Hopefully that helps. It's the second round. We're labeling the neuron. Let's look at a couple more diagrams that are already labeled and just make sure we are all on the same page on all the pieces and what's going on. Here's a much more detailed drawing of the axon and all the parts. And just so we get a clear picture that these cells, these neurons, are not just like hanging out by themselves like this. This is what, a bunch of them might look like, just like a forest, just a mesh, a spider web of cells going everywhere. But we're just pulling out one to look at the pieces by itself. Okay. So again, cell body, the soma here, dendrites along the outside. You can see this is a little bit more three-dimensional view. They look like little stumps coming out, like trees. I think that's actually the word dendrite means tree. That's what they are, like little tree trunks coming out, little tree branches. You got the axon. Here it's showing something interesting that I did not show in the other diagrams, but an axon doesn't actually have to be single. And this one actually has a split where it's actually showing that the axon can split and go into different directions to feed different things, different cells, different other cells. This one's got myelin on it. We got the axon hillock starting here, the axon sort of underneath. Nerve impulse is moving this way. We got the myelin. We got the again, you see this one shows a cool little cross section where you got the axon coming through the myelin. You can see the myelin is just like this fatty tissue wrapped around it here. Again, the spaces in between here is where we're gonna see these sort of jumps in conduction. We get to the end, this splits off into these axon terminals, where again you have the terminal buttons at the very end here, and then this is another neuron that's sort of there to receive the information from this axon, and the information sort of flowing from this cell to that cell. Okay, let's do it one more time, just because, why not? I like repeating stuff. You repeat things and you tend to remember them. Okay, so I like it because this looks very different than the other one. It's a very different picture. You still get to see, you get the idea of what's going on. What's in there? Well, this is the cell body, it's the soma. There's the nucleus right in the middle. There's all the tree branches, right? The dendrites all the way on the outside. You got the axon, the hillock, just right here. There's the place where the axon begins. It's going down the axon's going down this way. It's then ending. This one's showing it, instead of just feeding to another neuron, it's feeding to a muscle to tell that muscle to contract or to release or whatever it is. This is whatever signal is sending to this muscle. These are the terminal branches. These are the buttons on the end. This is shown, it's not sliced, it's just showing like this is a cross section, like this is continuing. It could be a very long neuron. And you got it's showing so the myelin sheath on here. It doesn't really show the nodes very well there. There's a node there, maybe a node here. And it's showing the same conduction. We get the idea of what the parts are. It's actually fairly easy to recognize all the pieces, even though this looks very different than my drawing, looks different than the last diagram, you get the idea what the parts are pretty quick. This is a cross section of a cell body. Again, this looks like some kind of monster out of a horror film, but this is the, if you take and cut open the cell body, you can see the sort of axon going this way. Here are some of the dendrites around the outside of it. So inside, again, all these little pieces all around here, these little different sort of like little beans or whatever they are in here, and the different components you see, these are all different organelles within there. Again, think mitochondria and that kind of stuff, and it's all floating around in this fluid, okay? Cytoplasm. It's all inside of the cell. You got the nucleus in the center, and the nucleus has within it like the nucleolus, which is like the what sort of feeds and gives energy to the nucleus, so that it can actually decide, it can actually make decisions, do things. And decisions, I mean like to fire or not fire, stuff like that. Okay, so this, remember, it's receiving information here. It's going to receive information from other cells in the dendrites, decide what to do with that information, and then decide whether or not to fire down its axon. That's all that's happening inside the cell body. Here's another picture. This one, the cell body, this one's coming out of the textbook. So you have, again, it's just showing all these different pieces, all these different things in here. They're just labeling organelles, right? There's lots of different ones. You can get down to lots and lots of structures within this, within the cell body. We're just not doing that. We're just sticking with the organelles. There's a nucleus that is basically the brains. You got cytoplasm and everything's floating in. You got the membrane, and this is a cross section. Obviously, the cell body, the cell is not just floating around in your body all open, right? This has just been like cross sectioned out, so the membranes have been cut open so you can see, but it's all got a membrane around the outside of it, keeping everything in and allowing it to exchange fluids and other ions and things with the fluids outside in the spaces in your body and brain and things. All right, so that's cross section of the cell body. Let's look at this one. I like. This breaks down it just shows a little bit more. It's labeling again. If you're tired of hearing about this stuff, great, you can skip the stuff. But I think repeating, being repetitive about certain things is showing, especially stuff that's really, it just comes to memory, and just memorize what the parts are and what they're doing. I think it's good to sort of see it multiple times. So here's it's just a video showing all the pieces. It's like a 3D rendering. Okay, hope you like it.
A typical neuron consists of three main parts: dendrites, the cell body, and the axon. Dendrites receive information from the axons of other neurons. A typical neuron may have many dendrites which resemble the trunks and branches of trees, and in fact, the word dendrite comes from a Greek word meaning tree. The cell body, also called the soma, contains a number of structures that are important for the functioning of the cell. The nucleus contains the cell's DNA. The genes of the DNA determine and control the functions of the neuron. Within the nucleus is another structure, the nucleolus, which transcribes the information contained in the genes into RNA, which in turn makes the substances necessary for the neuron to live and function. On the surface of the cell body is a small bump, called the axon hillock, from which the cell's single axon travels toward other cells. If enough excitation occurs at the axon hillock, then an action potential is propagated down the entire length of the axon. By means of the action potential traveling down the axon, information eventually passes from one neuron to another, or to glands or muscles. Events that occur along the dendrites, cell body, and axon are ultimately responsible for everything from our thoughts and actions to our feelings, dreams, and desires. The event that makes all of these possible is the action potential.
All right, I mentioned action potential there, so when I talk about the conduction along the axon, right? That's the action potential that we'll talk about in the next section as well. But it's nice to sort of get a preview of what that's talking about and connecting it all together. All right, so I want to point out, again, this is a 3D rendering. the cells are never perfectly round like that, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like and what the pieces are. You can sort of picture it in a more three-dimensional way. What other kind of neurons are we talking about? We talked about sort of efferent and afferent ones that all fall under the category we talked about so far. They have, cell bodies, dendrites, axons, axon terminals, sometimes with myelin, sometimes not. We also have something called an interneuron. Neurons which connect one neuron to another in the same part of the brain or spinal cord. The thing there is the spinal cord. So one of the examples is something called a reflex arc that's in the spine. Now, I remember, as a kid, you go to get you go to see the doctor, and they would bring out this funky hammer. But why do doctors hit us in the knee or elbow and other spots with a rubber hammer during exams? Like, what are they trying to prove? Like, why are they smacking us around? I remember thinking as a kid, like, why is this doctor coming at me with a hammer? Well, it turns out that there are most things we consider reflexes, right? We have lots of reflexes we talk about, but there are specific reflexes that are being tested for every time you're hit in the knee. So when you're hitting the knee in a certain spot, your knee kicks out. There's one your elbow that makes your elbow sort of jump. There's lots of different ones. These are all testing specific kinds of reflexes. And it's actually really interesting because what that is testing for is actually the health within your spinal cord. Because the spinal cord actually, there's a little part of the spinal cord, little tiny sliver that comes down. It really is an extension of your brain all the way down. So your brain is all this sort of gray matter that's coming down your spinal cord also, right? So there's a little part of your brain that comes in there. What happens is you're somehow in this part of evolution, we realize that in order for you to have a reflex, it would go all the way to your brain for you to think about, should I pull my hand away or kick my knee out or whatever it is I'm supposed to do? That would take too long. We actually might end up getting damage to those parts of the body. So your body's set up so that there's a little part of your brain that runs down your spinal cord that allows us to make quick reflexive actions before we've even realized that we've done it. Those are what reflexes are, and it's a reflex response. Those are all parts of this reflex arc that utilizes interneurons to connect our motor and sensory neurons together in order to make a quick, decisive response. Okay, so think of it this way. You get smacked in the knee, specific nerve there in your knee, and what happens is that signal goes from your knee, your afferent nerves travels up to your spinal cord, and instead of going then up your spinal cord to your brain and you having to think about it, it automatically closes a loop with an interneuron here, closes that loop, and kicks a trying to think which way this is going. Kicks this into action to send a signal down the motor neuron back to your knee and to your foot to kick out. Right, so all these different spots that they just check for reflexes are all really checking to see that if there's a healthy response within your spinal cord, and if these interneurons are really doing their job and doing the job the way they're supposed to. So this little smack on the knee here is triggering this reflexive response, and it's really preventing. It's actually, the signal's being sent to your brain at the same time because you do feel it, but your leg is kicking out before your brain even registers what's happening. Okay, so the sensory neuron comes in, tells, it signals to this interneuron to just quickly connect back to a motor neuron, send that back to your foot, and it kicks out. And that's a sort of reflex reaction. Now, there are other kinds of reflex reactions that you probably are aware of, especially when it comes to things like pain. This one seems kind of silly, but let's say if you've ever been cooking or something and you've accidentally touched something really hot. Well, a very similar thing happens. Your skin receptors, your sensory neurons will sense the pain, the heat in your fingers, and it sends up this red one here, sends up to your spinal cord. Your spinal cord quickly closes the loop with an interneuron. It sends a signal back down the motor neuron, and your hand will pull away from the stove before you've even realized that you've started to burn your hand. Oftentimes, those kinds of reactions are very reflexive and don't require you to register the pain and think about it. Like, oh, I probably should, pull my hand away. It's also interesting too, because if you've ever had to carry something, carried something really hot. I remember this as a kid a couple times. Actually, as an adult, you heat something with the microwave and you take it out in your hands, and it's now burning hot, and it's not burning your fingers. Well, your interneuron, that little reflex loop, is telling you to drop, to let go, and reflexively just drop the thing. Now, if you do that, you're now dropping potentially molten hot soup or whatever it is you're heating up all over yourself by letting that reflex sort of do it. So we have to actually override that reflex loop to tell ourselves to sort of keep holding on and to, maybe quickly set it down quickly while, burning our fingertips, just to make sure that we don't cause extra damage. So sometimes you can override those reflexive loops, but it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of concentration. And even that, sometimes you can't override it. You may end up dropping it anyway, especially if it's really, really hot. So it's interesting sort of interplay. Your body wants to keep you safe and be able to react to things. But sometimes you have to know that it's actually less safe to do so, and you have to sort of override that reflexive response. It takes a lot of effort to do so sometimes. Have you ever tried, your hand's burning, you gotta just keep holding onto it, put it down. It actually takes a lot of effort to override that reflexive response, to just set it down and throw it down on the ground. Out of the detours, go back. What other cells we got? We got, besides neurons, we have glial cells. Glial cells make up, a large portion of the brain as well. And they don't function the same way that neurons do. They're not sending information. They're not even connecting neurons together in terms of the impulses. They have lots of different kinds of jobs in the nervous system, and most of it is as support mechanisms for the neurons. So one of the primary functions of glial cells is to produce myelin. There are two main types of myelinating glial cells. Some of these words are just fun. I mean, I know you might think like, oh, those are complicated, but sometimes just certain words just roll off your tongue and are just kind of fun to say. Like, this is an oligodendrocyte. An oligodendrocyte. So, say that. Hopefully you're by yourself. It doesn't sound weird, like not in the middle of a coffee shop. But say it out loud. It's fun. Oligodendrocyte. So, oligodendrocytes produce myelin in the brain and the spinal cord. Almost 75% of glial cells in the brain are oligodendrocytes. So, there's a lot of stuff going on, and because we require a lot of myelin and a lot of fast conduction from the brain to other parts of the body, there's going to be a lot of these cells in the brain to keep all the neurons myelinated. Okay, and then you have these things called Schwann cells, or just Schwann, I guess. But I always want to, when I see SCH, I want to go like Schwann. Schwann cells produce myelin in the rest of the nervous system. So as you leave the brain and go to other parts of the body, when you have myelin, it's these Schwann cells that are ones that are actually producing the myelin and keeping the cells myelinated. So here's a couple of photos. Most of the pictures, even my drawing and the pictures that we were looking at a second ago, those were of these Schwann cells, because they look like just little. Again, it's hard for me not to think of a pool noodle. Little just protectors. What I'm actually envisioning, because I grew up, working with my dad, who was a contractor. We used this stuff like pool noodles to wrap things like pipes, to keep people from getting burned on hot pipes and things. That's sort of what I'm picturing. Is it looks sort of like a pool noodle. It's this like foam that we put on pipes and things to actually keep them from getting damaged, but also for people from burning themselves on the pipes. Anyway, but you can imagine a pool noodle is, I think, a little more generally globally understood. So these little protective coatings, you can see it's actually really a living sort of organism that's surrounding this. It's got its own little nucleus here, and it's generating the myelin that's protecting the axon. The oligodendrocyte is it looks more like a sort of star-shaped cell that connects to axons and produces the myelin and puts the myelin on the axons themselves, right? They have the same or very similar function, very different looks to them, but they're doing similar things. Remember, the oligodendrocytes here are in the brain. These are in the rest of the nervous system outside of the brain, generally speaking. The reason why myelination and conduction speed are sort of important is because we can't risk, a slow response, especially when things could be damaging parts of our body or there's pain involved, that kind of stuff. We want quick responses. So our survival depends in part on how rapidly messages can move through the nervous system. Can we get a message from our fingers that, they're burning, to the brain for us to make a decision and back to our hands, or to our spinal cord and back to our hands quick enough? That means we have to have axons that transmit information as quickly as possible. Well, one way to do that is just to have huge neurons, just create super fat neurons that can actually then, conduct as much of a signal as possible and do it really quickly. And you'll see this like squid, like giant squid, for instance, have these 0.5 millimeter thick neurons that allow conduction of like 30 meters per second. So they can actually transmit information very quickly, very fast, because they have super huge neurons that are like visible. So as a side note, a lot of what we know, at least early on, about neurons, we know because of giant squid, because their neurons were so large we were able to study them even without a microscope, or with very little help from microscopes, and be able to see all the pieces and parts and understand how they work and hook electrodes up to it and see how they function, because they're so huge. But as people, we can't really get away with that. We can't just have these giant rope-like neurons flowing through our body, especially when we have so many of them. So instead, vertebrates can increase conduction speeds without large axons by insulating nervous cells with myelination and triggering, again, saltatory conduction. Now, if you're like me and you hear this term saltatory conduction, my mind goes right to salt. And I start thinking about sodium, like table salt. But this saltatory conduction has a different route to it. Let's take a detour for a second and talk about that. I only do this because I think it helps to really make it make sense, and maybe you'll remember saltatory conduction better, knowing what words are related to it and where it comes from. The word saltatory comes from a Latin word, like lots of things do, saltare, which means to jump, leap, or dance. And the suffix tori at the end just means something that's related to or has the quality of that root word. Now, so, why do I care? Well, saltare and the saltatory conduction, if you remember what it means, like to jump, leap, or dance, you kind of get the idea that it has to do with this jumping of the signal down a myelinated cell. The saltatory, you might think, doesn't sound familiar to me. But in French, the word sauter means to jump, and it has the same sort of roots related to it. Saltar in Spanish is to jump. And common words that we still use that still refer back to this is like somersaults. Even assault. Like assault is to attack somebody. If you think about it, it's like to jump on somebody, assault them. And even the word saute, like from cooking, is because when you're sauteing something in a pan, right? And you're causing the thing in the pan to sort of jump around. You're sort of mixing and constantly sort of jumping the food in the pan as you're sauteing. So saute even comes from the same root that saltatory comes from. And even there's, jumping spider family is I'm going to say this wrong. Salticity, I think, is the family of jumping spiders. A salticity it also comes from the same saltatory. And again, if you like visuals, so this is sort of saltatory conduction here, where you have myelin and you have the points, it's jumping. So here's a regular unmyelinated cell where the signal is just slowly working its way down the cell like this, where with myelinated cells, it's able to jump across the myelin to these nodes of Ranvier and creating this saltatory conduction. And just for fun, You can think of this as sort of saltatory locomotion, because rabbits get around by jumping. Their motion is sort of saltatory. Okay? So if that makes sense. Saltatory conduction, it's this conduction of electricity through an axon across these nodes of Ranvier, jumping from one to the next. One of the ways in which we know about the importance of myelin is what happens in myelinated cells that require myelin for conduction. What happens when that myelin breaks down, or if the cells that create myelin stop creating them? Well, one of the outcomes is multiple sclerosis. So a little detail, let's talk about multiple sclerosis and take a look at how the degeneration of myelin in these cells actually leads to a lot of motor functioning problems and eventually a complete breakdown of the nervous system. Let's check that. This is from 2 Minute Neuroscience. It's a channel I really like. This guy is really smart, breaks down things very simply. So if you want more information about this, definitely check out this QR code and go to his page. Tons of stuff about neuroscience. He breaks down everything in 2-minute chunks. Very, very quick, very easy, very digestible chunks. So let's watch this one.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a central nervous system disorder that involves the abrupt appearance of neurological symptoms, which usually occur for the first time between the ages of 20 and 50. The symptoms of MS vary from person to person, and almost any nervous system function can be disrupted in the disease. The most common initial symptoms involve visual disturbances, abnormal sensations, and weakness. The causes of the disease are not fully understood and are thought to involve genetic and environmental factors. Multiple sclerosis is characterized by damage to the myelin sheaths surrounding the axons of neurons in the central nervous system. This myelin damage disrupts the conduction of action potentials along these axons, which is thought to cause many of the symptoms of the disease. The myelin damage can also lead to the deterioration of axons. The brains of MS patients can contain evidence of this damage in the form of plaques or lesions that are visible with some types of neuroimaging. The reason these attacks on a patient's myelin occur is not fully understood, but the damage in MS is most commonly attributed to an autoimmune attack. According to this hypothesis, the immune system in a patient with MS targets myelin, treating it as foreign. This autoimmune attack and the associated inflammatory response leads to damage to myelin, axons, and glial cells. What prompts the autoimmune attack is not known, however, and some have argued that MS is caused by a persistent infection instead. Either way, MS seems to involve excessive immune system activation in some respect, and the drugs that have proven most successful in treating it act to reduce inflammatory or other immune responses.
The last part of the section today we're talking about is just the other kinds of glial cells that are out there, or in there, in our brains, in our bodies. We got radial glia, we have microglia, and we have these things called astrocytes. Now, in looking through trying to find a decent picture to explain radial glia, one of the things I came across was this this post. It's a Instagram post by the Neurons family page, and I thought this was actually pretty fitting. So this actually looks, this tall green cell here would be the radial glia, and it essentially attaches in between two different things. It could be between different muscles, it could be between different parts of the neural system, and it actually helps in the development of new neurons. This is called neural genesis. So it's the creation of new cells, new neurons, and it helps to actually to help them move and get into position where they need to be in the nervous system, going from a little baby neuron to a toddler neuron. So it sort of helps raise it and bring it, to its full growth. So then it can then grow and mature in the system. So in a way, you think about it, the radial glia are sort of like the mama cells that help to grow neurons in your system. This is true of, like it says up here, that during fetal development, they create scaffolds that guide new neurons to their destinations. That's one way of thinking about thinking about it. Even in parts of the body where we can actually regenerate neurons and neural pathways, or anytime we learn and new neural pathways get created, it's the glial cells that are helping to guide the neurons to their positions where they need to be in order to facilitate that growth. If these kinds of things are interesting, again, this is a QR code. It'll take you to their Instagram page. They have lots of other cartoons depicting astrocytes, depicting all kinds of stuff in there, and they're very interesting and very humorous. I would suggest going there. It's a pretty cool page. Then we have microglia. Microglia look like this. It's like a lot of sort of dendrites everywhere, but microglia provide energy to neurons and respond to injury and disease by removing cellular debris. These are sort of like the bottom feeder fish in a tank, right? They're going through and actually cleaning up stuff, removing debris, helping to facilitate healing and getting rid of disease and other issues that are happening with neurons in the systems. These are, again, like another support cell, glial cells. The last one is an astrocyte. An astrocyte is another one that has it seems like multiple jobs within the nervous system. Astrocytes trigger the formation of 7 times as many connections in the neurons. Their absence may result in the loss of synapses, also appear to play a key role in learning. It also does, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, this is from memory, I'm pretty sure astrocytes also help to clean up debris and other stuff within the nervous system, and even so much as attaching to blood capillaries and stuff, trying to clean out some of the debris and stuff that can cause disease or interfere with neural processing. So even though it's not a neuron itself, it doesn't conduct information, it does facilitate lots and lots of that, of the neural transmission, and helps to support the neurons, especially in their synapses, which we haven't quite got to yet. Which a synapse is in the terminal button of an axon. It's the space in between the terminal button and the next neuron, the next receptor. So a synapse is just the space in between a axon terminal and the dendrite of the next neuron creates the synapse. And that's where the neural transmission between cells is occurring. That's exactly where we're going to get to next, is the communication within a neuron and between neurons in the next section. See you there. Hope you're excited.